Thanks so much here, Mike, you know.
A Lake, right? That's where that lake
It's on
came
A
down.
Lake, yeah. My first dive was in
Our co-producer of the Titanic feature film. Okay, you're going downtown.
July 9th, 2001. The diving vessel Seeker and her crew are playing host to a special History Channel expedition. They are embarking on a voyage that will take them more than 80 miles out into the North Atlantic and deep under the ocean's surface. It is a journey that will take the explorers back 40 years to a time when the Cold War was at its peak. Heading up this expedition is world-renowned underwater explorer and cinematographer Al Giddings, a veteran of expeditions to the Titanic and Andrea Doria. This expedition is unlike any other, for the wreck they seek is not an ocean liner or sunken battleship, but the remains of a virtual city, Texas Tower No. 4, a huge radar platform that housed 70 men and once stood proudly in the North Atlantic. For Giddings and his team, the mission is to shoot and preserve on video the rusting remains of Texas Tower No. 4. Joining them are Larry Phelan and Don Abbott, two men with deep personal ties to what lies beneath. Their lives were changed forever that January night Texas Tower No. 4 plunged into the icy waters.
This is something that I never thought would happen, and as the day got closer to coming here, and I felt more and more apprehension about it, not knowing what to expect.
Phelan's father, Gordon, was the last commander of Texas Tower No. 4.
I'm sure I was the closest to Dad of the kids, because I was 14, and his oldest son. He did special things for me that you know, not all fathers do. Like when it would snow, he would take me on my paper route before he would go to base.
Don Abbott's dad, a welder, was the longest-serving civilian on the tower.
And my dad would take me down to see Tower 4 when he was working on it, and I would just wait there all day, just outside of Tower 4, watching them welding, and they were the best. They were the absolute finest welders you could get.
I'm backing down over it.
After an all-night voyage, the expedition arrives over the Texas Tower No. 4 wreck site.
The wreck is actually right over there where the anchor line is. That's something. Yeah, he's got it.
Right off the bow is where they're at. So I'd like to roll over the side here in 15 minutes. Kelly, you good with that?
Yeah.
What depth? 15 minutes? When I've got the camera in my hand and I give you guys a nod, we're very interested in documenting the structural damage and sort of how could such an accident happen and what contributed to that accident.
So that would put us...
Another member of the crew is Chuck Zamaro. An amateur historian, he has devoted much of his life to finding out the truth about Texas Tower No. 4.
I've been diving this wreck for 27 years, and I'm supplying Al with technical support and putting him in the best possible places where he can get some good shots.
For Giddings and his team, this will not be an easy Sunday dive. The remains of Texas Tower No. 4 lie buried under 185 feet of water. This crushing depth will allow the divers only a half hour of shooting for each dive. The wreck is a haunting sight that few have ever seen, and one never documented for television until now. Standing almost 30 stories tall and weighing over 5,000 tons, this massive hulk of steel was once a lone citadel on the front line of the Cold War.
Who would have thought we were preparing to defend our own shores right here off Jersey?
America prepares to face attack on its cities and industrial centers under a combined civilian defense program. Any community is vulnerable to possible bombing, including the final threat of the devastating atom. A screen of Air Force units goes into action to protect our borders from the unannounced arrival of the enemy. The enemy who apparently knows no mercy and who has signified his intention to conquer the world under the banner of communist imperialism.
It's the mid-1950s, and America has been prospering since the end of World War II. But it is still an uneasy time, for an enemy lurks. The Soviet Union is building its military arsenal at home and extending its influence across Eastern Europe. It is clear to all Americans that the USSR and communism have replaced Nazi Germany as the new threat. Now that the Soviets have the capacity to drop hydrogen bombs, the US government worries that bombers might reach American shores and wreak havoc. As a consequence, early detection of enemy aircraft becomes both an obsession and a necessity.
The attack can come at any time from any place.
The military builds the Distant Early Warning System, consisting of large radar installations strung across the northernmost part of the United States and Canada. The Soviets are most likely to target the northeastern industrial complex. Early warning aircraft patrol the skies, and Navy radar ships guard the seas. But these radars aren't powerful enough to detect enemy bombers in time. Other solutions are called for. In 1952, a study conducted by MIT recommends placing radars on giant ocean platforms. These platforms would extend radar coverage by 300 miles, enough time to scramble fighter jets to shoot down enemy aircraft. Air Defense Command recommends constructing 5 platforms, stringing them along the northeast coast from Nova Scotia in Canada to New Jersey. The radar platforms are called Texas Towers because their design is similar to ocean oil rigs off of Texas. Unfamiliar with matters at sea, the Air Force places the Navy in charge of building the Texas Towers. Although 5 are initially planned, only 3 are built: Towers 2, 3, and 4. In 1954, construction begins in Quincy, Massachusetts, on the first tower, number 2. They are radically different from anything the Navy, and especially the Air Force, has ever attempted before.
This was an engineering marvel. It was a unique design, nothing that they could look back at previous work and see how that was done and made it better.
Building the towers presents some unusual problems. Where would they store fuel for the generators that power the radar and computer equipment? How would they get enough fresh water? But these problems pale in comparison to implanting these steel islands in the deep, unpredictable, and dangerous waters of the North Atlantic. For Towers 2 and 3, the legs and platform are floated out to their locations together. Once the platform is jacked up, the extra legs, used for support, are discarded, leaving a 3-legged structure. Installing the towers in the North Atlantic is one of the engineering triumphs of the 20th century. Made entirely of steel, the structure is supported by hollow legs, sunk into the ocean floor. 80 feet above the surface of the sea is a wedge-shaped, triple-layered platform that houses generators, kitchens, a mess hall that doubles as a movie theater, and living quarters. On top of the platform are 3 radar antennae, enclosed in rubberized fabric domes that will scan the skies. Each tower has a 70-man crew made up of Air Force personnel and civilian employees of companies like RCA. The crew works multiple shifts to ensure the facility's operation around the clock.
We had on the towers as good equipment as could be put out there. The idea was to put a whole radar squadron 100 miles or so closer to Europe than we could on the land. And that's what happened.
Towers 2 and 3 are engineering successes, but the last tower, number 4, is a different story entirely. Nearly 200 feet below the surface of the ocean, Al Giddings and Chuck Zamaro capture with their cameras the lost world of Texas Tower number 4.
The Texas Tower was especially interesting because it really resembled a shipwreck, except the windows were square windows and the openings were not those sort of openings you'd see on a big ship like the Andrea Doria. It has a whole different feel to it.
Even though it is classified as a shipwreck, the tower was never designed or built for watertight integrity. For all intents and purposes, it's a building that they put out on stilts out in the middle of the ocean. All the doors were regular handled doors. It was built like a metal building, 7 stories above the surface of the ocean.
Texas Tower number 4 was doomed before it was even finished. it was a disaster waiting to happen.
"100 miles off the east coast, far out on the defense perimeter, rises a radar tower from the ocean floor, known as Texas Towers because of their similarity to ocean oil drilling rigs, which will house the most advanced type of radar detectors and is anchored in the bedrock of the ocean floor and is capable of withstanding any foreseeable Atlantic storm."
By mid-1957, Air Force crews are living on board Texas Tower No. 2, 100 miles east of Boston, and Texas Tower No. 3, 60 miles off of Nantucket. Meanwhile, the last tower, No. 4, is being built.
Texas Tower No. 4 was indeed a new adventure for the ocean world. It was remarkable for its time and for its place.
80 miles off the coast of New Jersey, Tower 4 will stand in 185 feet of water, more than twice as deep as the other towers. Because of this, the Air Force decides it needs bold new thinking and hires the New York engineering firm Moran, Proctor, Moiser, and Rutledge to design the tower.
The design consortium that ultimately had responsibility for Texas Tower No. 4 was indeed very capable, and they were very, very capable in the area of bridge design. However, they had no extensive background, or perhaps none at all, in the area of ocean engineering for marine structures.
From the surface, Tower No. 4 will resemble the other towers in every way. The triangular platform is basically the same, but because of the water's depth, its legs are designed very differently. Engineers decide to strengthen the tower's 300-foot-long legs with underwater supports called K-braces. To allow the massive legs to be floated out to sea, they have to be light and therefore thin. In fact, the leg walls are less than an inch thick, much thinner than the legs of the other towers. Because they are so fragile, engineers can't weld the K-braces to the legs. Instead, they use steel pins. In time, these pins would prove dangerously vulnerable to the ocean's wear and tear.
Texas Tower No. 4 involved a unique type of design, and engineers at that time did not know how to analyze all of the important potential loads and stresses that were developed in those systems.
During the 500-mile journey from Maine, a freak storm damages 2 of the K-braces, a sign of things to come.
At that point, the decision could be made to take the structure back to land, effect repairs that could have been done much easier, but the decision was made to attempt to make repairs at sea.
Under pressure from the Air Force, the Navy commanders on site, along with representatives from the engineering firm and the building contractor, make the decision to forge ahead.
That turns out to be a very important decision because of the lack of good technology and equipment at that time to perform such intricate underwater operations. That later turns out to be a major problem for the structure.
Once on site, difficulties continue. The construction team battles strong currents, which make it impossible to sink the legs evenly. This ordeal places additional stress on the weakened leg braces. Meanwhile, the delicate task of putting the platform on top of the legs remains. The engineers had not anticipated such turbulent seas.
We were attempting to bring the tower in, and in the swells we were chafing up against the legs.
As a result, the legs are further damaged, dented by the massive weight of the 5,000-ton platform banging up against them.
It was another indication early about the difficulties of sophisticated construction activities at sea, and Texas Tower No. 4 was the first.
Despite numerous setbacks, the platform installation is eventually completed, and the legs are embedded in the ocean floor. The crew works hard to put the final touches on the tower. One of those crew members was Jim McCormick. He still shudders when he remembers the night he saw the horizon disappear.
Everything was black, and I couldn't see a crust on the wave. I watched it grow and grow and grow, and then the next thing it hit, and the water from the top of that wave splashed on the deck at 87 feet, so I know that that was one big beauty.
A Coast Guard warning about rogue waves comes over the radio.
And there was 3 hit us, and they actually pushed the tower back. You could hear it screeching and groaning and vibrating from the stress. And then it finally came back and we started to settle back in again. It was I would say, as scared as you can get when you see an ocean that size.
The tower is designed to withstand 125-mile-an-hour winds and 30-foot breaking waves. But as Jim McCormick's experience makes clear, these criteria are totally inadequate.
This is one of the roughest stretches of ocean in the world. 30-foot breaking waves happen every day. And in fact, today we know 100-foot high waves are appropriate for those kinds of conditions.
Today, Texas Tower Number 4 is still one of the largest underwater wrecks in the world. As they explore the tower, Al Giddings and Chuck Zamaro are eyewitnesses to the devastation that the ocean brings to poorly designed structures.
Maintaining a structure that's supposed to be stable in a non-stable environment is very difficult. You had a tower that was a weakened structure from the first time it was placed out here. It never really reached its design capabilities. And when you put that in an environment where you have your typical very nasty northeasterly storms and gales, and in an area that's susceptible to hurricanes, you're looking for a disaster to happen.
Yeah, I'm just breathing a little surface air here.
I knew right where I was, and I couldn't believe the devastation. Could not believe it.
Pieces of the structure. The size of the Texas Tower is interesting. I've heard comparisons to Titanic. I know that if magically the visibility was 1,000 feet, you'd be staring at this thing the size of, you know, sort of parts of the Empire State Building. It's a huge, huge structure. And considering the high drama that went along with losing this in the ocean, pretty sobering.
When we continue, Texas Tower Number 4 gets a new nickname, and it's not a term of endearment. November 1957, the Air Force takes control of Tower 4. Captain Reginald Stark is Tower 4's first commander when the tower is hit by Hurricane Daisy. Stark evacuates all personnel. It is the first and only time the tower will be evacuated. Captain Anthony Girillo alternates with Stark as the tower's commander.
First time I went out there, when I looked at it down there, it was a platform sitting in the middle of the ocean with nothing around.
Air Force personnel work alongside civilian technicians like Don Slutsky, a Burroughs Corporation computer expert. He remembers his first impression of the tower.
I looked at this tower and I thought to myself, what have I gotten myself into? I couldn't believe what I was looking at. They lowered this carrier called a donut, personnel donut, and was hoisted up to the tower deck, about 100 feet up, by a crane. When I got onto the tower, my fears were alleviated somewhat because it was very comfortable and seemed very safe to me. The work on the tower I found was no different than the work I did on land-based radar stations. The only difference was, well, home was the tower.
The tower runs 24/7, monitoring the North Atlantic skies for enemy aircraft. It is a mini-city at sea. 200,000 gallons of fuel are stored in the legs. Electricity comes from 7 locomotive-sized diesel engines. Sophisticated ionizing machines convert salt water into drinking water. 80 miles from the nearest harbor, the tower is entirely self-contained and all alone.
The accommodations I considered were excellent. The tower was bright, well lit inside, roomy. The food was excellent.
And of course we had to take care of our people, so we had to have something for them to do when they weren't on duty. And we had pool tables, ceramics, photoshops, ping pong, anything that we felt would be used.
Samuel Bucheri is a welder on the tower.
And they used to tell me that he used to stand on the deck and he used to see whales in the ocean, and I thought it was pretty neat. You know, I thought it was, geez, that was something that most people don't ever really get to see.
The tower is also located in one of the best fishing grounds in the world.
The fishing trawlers would come by, and we'd talk to them on the ship, and we'd tell them, hey, if you have any fish that you don't want, lobsters or anything else like that, hold on. We would swap some beer or cigarettes for them, and they would give us the catch that they had they didn't want.
I noticed we had an awful lot of fishermen, and they used to catch small fish, and they used to put a big hook on the end of the crane, and before you knew it, there were sharks coming up.
Wilbur Kaverick is an Air Force technician. He asks to be assigned to Texas Tower number 4 so that he can be close to his family on Long Island.
People would tear their shirts or their pants, or they needed this or that, and Wilbur would call me and ask me to please go get them, and I would go over to the Army-Navy Supply and get some things for the men, and I'd take them out and meet the chopper. And that was when I also took a TV out to them, when they said that they needed a TV.
We also had a basketball court. Only problem was we had one ball.
And they would shoot baskets there. Sometimes the ball would go over the side, and we'd have to lower the little surf boat and go out and pick them up.
They had a good time.
Boeing H-21 helicopters from Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod shuttle constantly back and forth between Tower 4 and civilization.
Otis Air Force Base was a very busy base. It had about 15,000 regular Air Force stationed there. At any time of the day, 24 hours a day, constellations were going. Those planes were going from Canada all the way down to past Puerto Rico.
Otis is the largest air defense command base in the world and serves as the headquarters for the Texas Tower 4604th Support Squadron. Airman Don Abbott works at Otis, refueling helicopters. His father, Dave, is a regular passenger to Tower 4.
So it was just one of those unbelievable circumstances where Dad and his son get together in the same base. A lot of the guys on the towers I knew because I was refueling their helicopters, and they knew my dad from working out there so long.
And as you came aboard, the choppers never shut their engines off, so you had to take that suit off and hand it to your replacement who was going back to shore, and he slipped it on. In the meantime, he's briefing you on what's going on in the tower and everything else, and you're taking your suit off, he puts it on, and okay, goodbye.
Personnel and supplies are also ferried to and from the tower on the cargo supply ship, the AKL-17, captained by Sixto Manguel. The AKL-17 is specially outfitted to unload cargo between the legs of the tower, but mooring onto the legs is a very delicate and time-consuming operation.
The AKL had to be positioned in such a certain way in relation to the ocean, the currents, the wind, the speed of the ship. All his men were drilled constantly so that they could function and be efficient at what they were doing.
The tower's position in international waters made it a magnet for ships of all kinds, especially Soviet spy ships, disguised as fishing trawlers.
I personally saw the trawlers. Sometimes we would see them fishing. Other times, no one was fishing. No one was fishing, just waiting. During the Cold War, they were here to pick up anything that might be of use to them.
With the Soviets' watchful eye posing a constant threat, the Air Force is reluctant to evacuate the tower, even in extremely bad weather.
One thing the tower did bring forth to me was that the Atlantic Ocean is a mean device. When these northeastern storms come up, they would come up and be awful, especially in the wintertime. The sea would swell so high that it would slap the bottom of the tower. It wouldn't allow anybody to get on the deck because it would blow them over.
To extend its radar coverage, the tower is placed as close as possible to the edge of the continental shelf. Just beyond the tower, the ocean's depth increases dramatically to thousands of feet. As a result, waves break directly on the tower.
So that as big waves are coming in from the North Atlantic, they trip on this water depth, much like waves do when you're at the beach. This results in extremely severe wave and current conditions, and TT4 experienced those conditions.
Under bombardment from the North Atlantic, the tower shakes constantly. In bad weather, the motion is even worse.
It was like being on a ship with the motion of the tower moving back and forth. Many of the men got sick. They got seasick.
It had a nickname. As a matter of fact, that nickname appeared on a big sign in the mess hall. Texas Tower 4, Old Shaky.
In my quarters where I slept, the bathroom door kept squeaking back and forth, back and forth. If I ever heard it stop, I got concerned.
Worried by the tower's constant movement, Colonel Cutler installs a plumb line in his cabin to observe just how badly the tower is shaking.
The plumb was moving back and forth, and then it would gyrate, going in a circle. And then I knew there had to be a problem with this thing. There's something wrong.
And a lot of times I thought, well, this back and forth, going back and forth all the time, it's just like you bending a piece of wire going back and forth, back and forth. Someday it's going to give.
When I look at the tower and the way that the tower was laying on the bottom, it looked like it went down very violently, and it looked like it went down very fast.
A tragic accident is something that you just, you can't prepare for it. It just hammers you real hard. And then you begin asking questions, why did this happen? It didn't have to happen. You start second-guessing everybody that's supposed to be top of things, and you question authority.
The ocean itself is unpredictable. You could take the best designed structures that man can come up with and turn them into piles of tinder.
Coming up, bad news for the crew of Texas Tower No. 4. The storm of the century is headed their way. Only a year after it was built, Texas Tower No. 4 is already showing signs of weakness. Every storm takes its toll.
The weather on Texas Tower 4 was very important to everybody on the tower. If the weather was bad, there's little apprehension, and I could understand that.
In a storm, evacuation would be next to impossible. There are 2 small lifeboats, but they are 100 feet above the water, and everyone knows the brutal reality.
We had 2 boats there, 26 feet long. There was no way you could get them in the water. And if you were going to get off the tower, you had to do it way in advance before the storm came. Otherwise, forget it. There's no way you were going to get off that tower. The only thing I could think of, they didn't expect it to happen.
The crew begins to hear clanging noises beneath the sea.
There was always some problem, and the civilian contractor would bring a team out in good weather. Of course, it's a lot easier, but in bad weather, you're never sure how good the fix was.
The tower's noises and rocking motion are so bad, the design engineer tells the Navy that a definite hazard exists to the safety of the tower and the personnel aboard. The Air Force commissions a motion study of the tower. The study reveals that the pin joints in the legs, which had been hastily repaired during the tower's installation, are loose. Professor Robert B. helped analyze the study's results.
Once I began to understand that the major difficulty was associated with these pin joints, attempts were made to make repairs underwater. Ultimately, those attempts were not effective. It was a Band-Aid solution to something that was much more critical.
When Colonel Cutler's tour of duty ends in April 1960, he strongly recommends to his superiors that something be done, and soon.
When I left, I sent a letter in telling them the fact that there's too much movement going on, and they ought to send a team out to Tower 4 and check it out.
In response to Cutler's request, the Air Force takes a new approach. This time, they install bracing above the waterline, called X-bracing. The X-bracing is designed to strengthen the legs, but they actually worsen the situation, creating more resistance to waves.
Some have felt that the X-bracing was essentially a stay of execution for the structure. I think we've come to understand that it may have only been adding another rifle to the firing squad.
With Cutler's departure, command of the tower is passed to Captain Gordon Phelan, Larry Phelan's dad. At 33, he is already an 18-year veteran of the service. Phelan joined the Navy as a teenager, fought at Iwo Jima, and then transferred to the Air Force to become a pilot while raising a family. Phelan regularly phones his wife Ellie and their 4 children on Cape Cod.
Most of the calls from the tower to Mom were made in the evening, and my mom had a favorite spot in the foyer where she would sit. There was continual damage to the tower, high seas or low seas. So my mom was constantly concerned about the safety of the tower, the well-being of the people on the tower, and of course my father.
What is your name, please?
My name is Captain Gordon Phelan.
Just months after assuming command of the tower, Gordon Phelan appears on To Tell the Truth, one of the most popular television shows of the time.
3 stalwart gentlemen this time, panel, each one claiming to be Captain Gordon Phelan, stationed out at sea.
For one, what is the worst feature of your life on Texas Tower number 4?
The isolation.
I remember Ellie calling home and saying they were going to be on To Tell the Truth and to make sure that we would see it. They got to go to New York and spend a couple of days there, all expenses paid, so they were all excited.
Will the real Captain Gordon Phelan please stand up?
Back on Old Shaky, life carries on. Close friendships form. Fellow Commander Sixto Manguel and Gordon Phelan become good friends.
My father was captain of his ship. Captain Phelan was captain of his Texas Tower. And they got to be pretty close because my father would come home and talk about Captain Phelan and his crew members. And after a while, you know, we were almost like a family.
Don Slutsky remembers the haircuts he used to get from his friend Louis Leno.
And he did a wonderful job. And he would talk to me about his wife. He was newly married, and he missed his wife terribly.
Another favorite aboard Old Shaky is Raul Baki, the tower's medic.
And a lot of us called him Doc. Thoroughly decent guy who everybody looked up to, as I did.
Since he was older than most people on the tower, he was almost considered a father figure.
With the approach of fall, the crew of Texas Tower number 4 prepares for the arrival of hurricane season. In September, word of a powerful storm reaches the tower.
Hurricane Donna slashes up from the Caribbean into Florida. Already the killer of at least 125 persons, the savage tropical storm rampages over the Florida Keys and roars north.
Air Force weathermen predict Donna will hit the tower dead on. The decision is made to evacuate. A Coast Guard cutter is dispatched from New York. But by the time the cutter gets there, the hurricane has already arrived. The first attempt to drop men onto the deck of the cutter almost ends in disaster when the donut is knocked into the water.
At that point, Captain Phelan called us all into the dining room and informed us that there was going to be no transfer, no evacuation, because it was too dangerous. So we were going to have to ride out the storm on the tower.
Donna is much more severe than expected. Winds are clocked above 136 knots. The tower is under assault.
The fury of the sea was so strong, the tower, if collapsed, would fall at least a minimum of 100 feet and further into the water. It was not watertight. There was no way that any ship could save anybody before going under or being swept away. Everybody understood that.
Hurricane Donna was a very, very severe hurricane. The storm was one that generated, from what we know, waves of the order of 60 to 65 feet. The personnel on board the structure reported that the green water from these wave crests were reaching the deck of the structure.
And suddenly, there was this loud crashing sound, metallic metal crashing sound, and the tower shuddered. And we all ran to grab our life vests.
The flying bridge under the platform had broken loose and been hurled against one of the legs.
I was standing near an outside bay door with Sergeant Boggy, and I turned to him and asked him, "Doc, do you think we'll make it?" He turned to me and said, "Don, don't worry. She will hold together."
Shortly afterwards, there is a strange lull in the storm.
Then, a while later, the storm hit again, this time in another direction.
The eye of the hurricane passes right over the tower.
Tower 4 was extremely lucky to survive Donna. If the storm had lasted longer, the structure probably would have failed in that storm.
Commander Gordon Phelan notes in his daily log, "Never again." Hurricane Donna far exceeds any conditions the design engineers anticipated. The tower is now critically wounded.
It was just a question of when and how many lives it would take.
A hotly contested election campaign closes with Senator John F. Kennedy, the choice of his countrymen, as the 34th
John F. Kennedy's close victory over Richard Nixon in the fall of 1960 dominates the news. Meanwhile, Texas Tower has survived Hurricane Donna, but just barely. In November, civilian divers arrive to try to repair the fractured underwater supports. Don Slutsky quizzes one of the divers in the dining hall.
I turned and asked him what he was planning to do that day. He told me he was catching the helicopter. Then he hesitated and told me that he had just spoken to his wife. He didn't think he was going to be coming back to the tower. At that point, I think I understood what was happening. I felt that this was no longer a place for me.
Don Slutsky joins the diver on the next helicopter out, never to return. 2 weeks later, the Air Force decides to close down radar operations and evacuate most of the personnel, leaving a reduced crew on board. Their mission: keep the tower out of Soviet hands while a small group of civilian repairmen do their best to keep the tower standing. Major repair work is planned for the spring of 1961, but in the meantime, winter sets in and weather conditions steadily deteriorate. Sensing a possible evacuation, more and more Soviet trawlers gather near the tower. Another storm hits the tower in mid-December. For many of the men, the experience is more than they can bear. The tower has become a living hell. After the storm passes, Air Force Private Louis Leno drafts a letter to the President-elect. Dear Senator, I am in the United States Air Force, stationed on Texas Tower number 4. On December 12th, we had a very bad storm. Again, they had time to evacuate, but did not. The winds were up to 80 knots, and believe me, sir, I was scared. I did not expect to be here now, for if this tower should ever fall in weather as we had, there would be no survivors. I called my wife and told her about the situation, and she started crying. I will sum up the letter in these few words. I want to get off this tower for good. Yours truly, Louis Leno.
Yeah, when I saw the letter, I was very surprised at all the things he wrote in it. I had no idea that it was that bad.
When Lou came home on leave, he would go into things like the swaying of it, tying yourself into your bunk, hearing men crying themselves to sleep at night. And he said at one time, I think one of those men is me. And do you think that makes me a coward?
Gordon Phelan confides to his wife that he has repeatedly asked for the men to be evacuated. The Air Force refuses his requests. During his Christmas leave, Roald Baki shares his fears with his brother.
He said, I served for a few years on a minesweeper in the South Pacific. I was in some really tough situations in Korea, but I have never been as frightened as I am aboard this tower.
In early January, divers discover yet another broken brace. The K-bracing, critical to the structure's stability, is now completely ineffective. On Thursday, January 12th, there is an all-day emergency meeting in New York, attended by the Air Force, the design engineers, and the contractor. The Air Force decides to shut down the tower at the beginning of February and to resume repair work in the spring. The design engineers argue that the evacuation should happen immediately. But the Air Force maintains that it needs time to get top-secret equipment off the tower. The next day, Friday, January 13th, Don Abbott drives his father Dave and a few other workers down to the AKL-17. Theirs will be the final supply boat to Texas Tower number 4.
Dad said, you know, this is the last time I'll be going out. I've always completed the job. And that's what most of these guys said to their wives.
Bill Ide is a welder who had spent a lot of time on Tower 4.
He felt this was the last time he was going to take that chance, that he had really played his cards, you know, as much as he could with this last trip, that luck wasn't going to stay with him much more as far as the tower was concerned.
But the last time, when he was home, he said to me, if anything ever happened to him, that he wanted me to find someone good to take care of me. That's what he said.
Meanwhile, Gordon Phelan's tour of duty is almost over. He has only 10 days left. His successor arrives at Otis Air Force Base.
I was scheduled to go out to relieve Gordon Phelan, and we were going to spend a week on the tower together so he could hand over, is the term we use, the tower to me. And then at the end of the week, he'd fly back, having completed his entire tower tour.
The weekend weather forecast for January 14th and 15th is ominous. Winds are predicted between 40 and 60 knots. At Otis, Major Reginald Stark, the first commander of Tower 4, orders the AKL-17 to head for the tower, take on equipment, and stand by for a possible evacuation.
He left dockside and went out there to try to be about nearby, just in case there was danger to the personnel on the Texas Tower. And when they got out there, the sea still hadn't been that rough.
By midday Saturday, January 14th, the AKL-17 has taken on 22 tons of equipment from the tower in anticipation of the February shutdown. Jeanette Leno speaks to her husband, Louis.
He told me he was real excited because he said they were taking all the equipment off, and he felt that he was going to be getting off, you know, the next day.
Seas were moderate, 8 to 10 foot. Winds were relatively calm, and Captain Phelan reported back to shore that everything was okay on the tower.
While it was calm around the tower, the AKL-17 gets a bad weather forecast.
Captain Manguel gave Captain Phelan a definite warning that severe weather conditions would exist, say, within 12 hours. He urged Captain Phelan to make preparations to leave the tower.
But at Otis, Major Stark gets a different, much less severe forecast. Stark doesn't think it warrants an evacuation.
He was aware that there was a storm coming up the coast, but it didn't look like it was going to cause them any major problem at that time.
Unfortunately, they believe the forecast. Forecasting storm motions and movements is historically not reliable.
Later that day, Captain Manguel waves goodbye as the supply ship backs away from the tower for the last time. Back on board the Seeker, Don and Larry get their first glimpse of the footage of the Texas Tower wreck, shot by Al Giddings and his team. It is a sobering experience.
After 40 years of supporting the tower, that floor area and the welds around it just finally gave out.
So this deterioration is going to continue until it's going to probably be all flat on the ground?
Right.
It's hard to comprehend the complete picture of the tower in the shape it's in now. It looks like a giant grave to me. I know there were no bodies on board, but still, it's you know, the last place those men had their feet on the ground.
For me, the wreck is a grave site. It's a sacred site. We go and pay our homage when we dive it.
When we continue, another fierce winter storm is headed for the tower. Can the crew be evacuated in time? Early morning, January 15th, 1961. Texas Tower number 4 is shuddering in the face of a huge nor'easter. Monstrous waves charge the superstructure, hurling sheets of spray over the deck. The tower's platform is sheathed in ice. Wilbur Kovarik calls his wife.
When I spoke with Wilbur at 7:30 Sunday morning, you could hear awful clanging. The metal hitting metal was terrible. And you could hear them screaming and yelling.
9:30 a.m. Weather forecasters at New York's Newburgh Air Base call Regional Commander Colonel William Banks to say conditions have taken a severe turn for the worse. A child answers, saying, "Daddy will call you back." Banks never gets the message. The AKL-17 is only a few miles from the tower.
Captain Phelan and Captain Manguel did talk on a regular basis. Their primary concern, of course, was the eventual path of the storm, the mounting seas, the increasing wind, safety of both the tower and the ship.
Sometime around 10:30 in the morning, there was a very loud bang that was heard by everybody on the tower. Both the chief civilian engineer on the tower and Captain Phelan called in to their respective supervisors.
Part of the below-water K-bracing has broken loose and is banging against one of the legs. It is too dangerous to put divers in the water to attempt emergency repairs. 1 p.m. Captain Phelan calls his wife and tells her the tower is gyrating, a term he has never used before. Ellie Phelan asks him if the tower will float if it collapses. He replies, no, the tower will go down very fast. No one could possibly be saved. Phelan also tells her he is worried about the safety of the AKL-17 and her crew. The ship is overloaded with equipment from the tower and is wallowing in growing seas.
The AKL-17 was about 10 miles away, having all it could do to save itself.
2 p.m. Phelan orders Captain Manguel to head for port, but Manguel stays despite worsening conditions. Another loud bang is heard. On inspection, Phelan and his engineer discover cracks in the above-water X-bracing. The tower is beginning to come apart. 3:15. Phelan tells a weather observer at Newburgh that the wind is now 80 miles an hour. Now maybe they will do something, he says. Phelan calls Otis and talks to Major Shepard. They agree the tower must be evacuated at the earliest lull in the storm, forecast for 3 a.m. the next morning. Phelan has to wonder if the tower will last that long. Air Force and Coast Guard helicopters are placed on high alert and readied for immediate takeoff as soon as the weather permits. The huge aircraft carrier USS Wasp and its battle group are maneuvering close by and are directed to the tower. The Wasp will send its helicopters too.
The choppers are on the deck. They're all fueled, ready to go. They can't launch in this weather.
6 p.m. In his last phone call to his wife, Phelan tells Ellie that the tower is beginning to break up. He orders all hands on deck to clear the helicopter landing pad.
That night he was talking to his wife, Ellie, and was saying that he didn't know there were so many religious men in his crew because he says there were sure a lot of them praying.
What these people had to have been experiencing at that time was absolutely terrifying. The winds are shrieking. It's painful to even be exposed to the wind because your skin is being stung by the rain and the water in that wind. It's almost like tearing your skin off. Now we're confronted with very, very large storm waves, and these waves have got heights of a 6 or a 10-story building. The waves are coming from all different directions.
Paul Yost, skipper of the Coast Guard cutter Agassiz, based in Cape May, New Jersey, is hoping for a good night's sleep.
I remember the wind screaming around the house, and I said to my wife, I hope that we don't get a call tonight.
But Yost does get a call.
By late evening, the phone rang. Coast Guard's Rescue Coordination Center in New York was on the phone. The comptroller told me that the Texas Tower was in serious trouble.
Captain Yost and his 20-man crew leave within the hour.
The seas were running 12 to 15 feet, and we were driving into it. and it was a long, miserable run of something over 100 miles to the Texas Tower 4.
The structure is being assaulted with these horrifying winds and horrifying waves. The first thing that we can expect to happen is that the joints begin to fail. And when the joints begin to fail, the braces also now begin to buckle. At this point in time, the structure can start to gyrate and rotate because it's really only being supported by the three legs, and they're not braced.
7 p.m., 18 miles southeast of Tower Number 4, the USS Wasp reports being hit by a giant rogue wave. It is now headed directly for the tower.
This single large wave is probably moving at a speed of 50 or 60 miles per hour. Failure is close at hand.
On board the supply ship, AKL-17, Sixto Manguel is helpless. All he can do is observe the constant blip of Texas Tower Number 4 on the radar screen. At 7:28 p.m., the blip suddenly disappears.
It was gone. He couldn't believe it. He looked at the radar wand again. As it swept around, no tower reflection. He grabbed the microphone for the radio and shouted, "Tower 4, Tower 4. No response, just static. The tower is gone.
When we first got to the location of the tower, it was a shock to see nothing there. An occasional piece of wreckage, that was it. We, of course, knew that it had gone.
The Coast Guard cutter Agassiz soon joins the AKL-17 in a combined search and rescue effort.
This tower was almost a small city. It was hard to believe that the whole tower was gone.
Blinded by freezing wind and 40-foot seas, the Agassiz and the AKL-17 search for survivors among the 28 men that plunged into the icy waters.
For a person that's been put into the water in the North Atlantic in January, is very much like being put into a bath of ice water. That's bad enough because hypothermia will quickly set in, but now this ice water has got storm waves embedded in it, and I'm not only fighting hypothermia, I'm fighting drowning directly from the wave forces that are being exerted on my body. In those kinds of conditions, the likelihood of survival is close to zero.
One of the most frustrating things about that evening, the seas were so rough that no effective search could be done that night. We were helpless to do anything about the brave men who had gone down.
None of the 28 men are found that night.
It was pretty rough last night. Lying in my berth, and the waves were slapping against the bottom of the boat, and you couldn't help think about what it was like that night for them before the storm knocked it down. It was an eerie feeling. This boat can go back. You know, that was a fixed item there, and the only thing that could do would go down. And I think everybody thought of that last night at some point in time. It must have been terrible.
When we return, the loss of Texas Tower Number 4 hits hard as families and the Air Force look for answers.
In 180 feet of water, one of 3 radar towers guarding the eastern seaboard topples into the sea and sinks, carrying down its skeleton crew of 28 men.
It might have been 2 o'clock Monday morning when the phone rang. I heard my mother grab the phone from her bed, and she was talking to my Aunt Ethel. My mom started to scream, and my aunt just point blank out said that the tower is gone, Dave is dead. She just went hysterical, and I couldn't control it. I actually had to slap my mom, and to get her to stop. I mean, she was just wailing and everything, and it was a tough moment.
Diana Ide is awoken in the middle of the night by her mother.
And she told me that a New York newspaper had called her around 1 o'clock, I think it was, and asked her if she was aware that the Texas Tower No. 4 had sunk.
Sandra Holzel, who is expecting her father home that week, hears the news on the radio.
And I can remember going to my brother's room and saying that I heard on there. He says, no, he says, you must be having a dream. I says, there's no dream. I said, I heard it. And we listened to the radio together. And my mother was downstairs watching television, and we went downstairs and we told her what we heard. And within a half hour, we had newspaper reporters on the front lawn.
The first inkling I had of the media and the reporters was the fact that somebody beat on the door, and it was somebody from Life magazine wanting to know if they could get a story. And I said, I haven't even had an official telegram yet. Get out.
Nobody called us. Nobody called us from the Air Force. Nobody called and said, gee, this is what happened.
Jeanette Leno had spoken to her husband just the day before.
He was hoping that I was pregnant. You know, he kept asking me, you know, about that, because he was really anxious to have children. And then, of course, I didn't find out till after the tower fell that I was pregnant with my daughter.
Lewis will never know his daughter, Luann, born September 1961. Ellie Phelan's brother gets on the first flight out of California to be with her.
When we got there, Ellie was sedated. They'd sedated her that night. And so she took it real hard, naturally. Gordon and her kids were her whole life. And to have Gordon taken like that was hard.
In a vast air-sea search for survivors, the aircraft carrier Wasp is joined by helicopters and destroyers. Faint tappings were heard on sonar, possibly from a submerged compartment.
The day after the tower is lost, a Navy destroyer picks up cryptic underwater tapping sounds on sonar. A Navy crewman reports he hears a human voice. Divers are dispatched to attempt a rescue.
I just felt sure that if someone was alive in the tower, that it would have to be my brother. And it was terrifying because obviously there was little chance of them getting him out as the days went by.
"4 days after the tower disaster, divers find Roald Baki's body floating on the ceiling in Captain Phelan's office. Most likely he had been assigned there by Phelan to maintain radio contact.
It leads me to believe that it's possible that Roy was alive for an extended period of time after the tower collapsed.
The bodies of Roald Baki and Troy Williams are the only ones retrieved from the disaster. The remaining 26 men are never found. Within a few days of the collapse, the Air Force abandons the search, and the AKL-17 returns to its home port, New Bedford.
My father stayed on a bridge for, I believe what he said was something like 18 hours straight. He came home feeling like defeated because his wish was that he could have saved all those men.
The families try to put their lives back together again. Memorial services are held around the country for the lost crewmen of Texas Tower No. 4.
You just keep on and on grieving because there was no funeral, and it just made you hope and hope that maybe someday he'd walk in the door.
For about 8 years after my father was lost on the Texas Tower, my mother would, at dinner time, set a place for my father, realize what she'd done, and very quietly take that place setting and put it away and carry on with the rest of dinner.
In July, 6 months after the tower's collapse, Edna Kovarik receives a strange phone call from a Long Island fisherman.
And he said, well, I have your husband's billfold. And I said, you've got to be kidding, you don't know where he is. He said, oh, yes, I do. He said he was on the tower, and his nickname was Bill.
The fisherman explains that he found the wallet 3 miles from where the tower went down, in the mouth of a large sea scallop. Edna goes to get the wallet the following day.
When I looked at it, I almost fainted. I couldn't believe it because I began to think about how many odds there was in returning that billfold. And this was like I got something back. I assume it was a miracle.
With the expedition almost over, Al Giddings and Chuck Zamaro make one final dive. Their goal is to retrieve some personal artifacts that have survived the years, reminders of the human lives that once filled this rusting wreck.
That was really there. The water.
You know, it looks like the sugar.
Oh yeah, right. Yes.
Some of the guys brought back some dinner plates and a few cups and things like that, and they shared those things with the relative, the sons. I thought it was a nice gesture.
Thank you so much.
That's what it looks like.
I mean, I don't have to hardly see any piece of it not to get emotional. The doorknob that was brought up today, my dad probably had his hands on that doorknob. I'm taking home a sugar shaker. My dad probably used that sugar shaker. You know, I really didn't have anything that was personally my father's. Now I have a sugar shaker.
With the tower lost and 28 men dead, the federal government looks for answers and someone to blame. In May of 1961, a Senate subcommittee releases a report that sternly criticizes the Navy, the designers, and the builders of the tower, calling the design criteria clearly inadequate. Meanwhile, the Air Force brings charges against the officers responsible for overseeing the tower. But the charges are either dropped or the officers found not guilty. While Texas Tower No. 4 has been mostly forgotten by all but the victims' families, Professor B believes there is much to be learned from what went wrong here.
Texas Tower No. 4 is an extremely important story about how good engineering firms, good construction and contracting firms, great military organizations can create disasters. It could have been prevented if the early warning signs had in fact been acknowledged, and it was ignoring those early warning signs that led to the disaster.
For the families of the lost crewmen, all that remains are the vivid memories of the valor displayed by their fathers, brothers, and husbands.
These people were all just normal, everyday American citizens that went out to the tower to try to make sure that this country was protected. They gave up everything.
Those were men who were patriots, who were protecting their country from a missile attack.
I'm proud of what my father did. He believed in his country.
It was just what we would hope all young Americans would feel, just a love for their country.
Hey, Larry.
Before heading back to land, Don Abbott and Larry Phelan come together for a final ceremony.
It's tough to be out here, but it's still great to be out here. It's like visiting the cemetery for me. So this is a real large cemetery. I hope for the families to achieve some kind of closure. I really can't explain closure. Every time I think I've got it, there's something else that I need to do. I may never get closure. Maybe the other families won't get closure. I hope that if they can, they will.
In 40 years since it's happened, I never thought I would be out here. It's lost. You know, you can't prepare for it. It just hammers you real hard. And this brings back a lot that, you know, I think I'll have to recover again. But I think it'll be an easy recovery. I mean, easier because I'll have a lot more knowledge of what happened. I feel like I wasn't there, but now I can see kind of what happened and have a better feeling for it.